Welcome back to the Web Hacking Vulnerability series. In this episode, we are exploring server-side request forgery, the vulnerability that allows attackers to abuse requests made between servers. Websites nowadays have different architectures, and as they grow, usually developers tend to implement service-based or microservice-based architectures. That means if there is a website, let's say Amazon.com, it might consist out of many different applications. For example, there might be authentication application responsible for authenticating users. There might be a payment gateway responsible for financial interactions, shopping basket just for holding items. And there might be many more, but the key point here is that those different applications do interact with each others, and those might be handled on the different servers, and when different servers send requests to each other, there might be some issues happening behind the scenes. Typical example of SSRF is usually the invoice generators. Those were exploited in the wild quite often, and usually the places where you can find these are e-commerce stores. So after you make a purchase, for example, on Amazon, there might be some backend service responsible for generating invoice after the purchase. And it will take your user data such as full name, email, maybe your address, and backend service might use that data to create the document. And sometimes in the URL, there might be that particular service URL used as the parameter, and sometimes users could abuse that, or maybe the malicious users could also abuse their actual data like full name, address, stuff like that, and issues could start happening from there. So this is just an initial step. As in my previous videos, I always like to emphasize that places where you can find those issues really matter. So let me give other examples where this issue might occur. So for example, webhooks could be used to fetch URLs to send or receive data. So those are really interesting candidates. URL preview pages. So for example, when you generate link previews by fetching metadata, usually the websites which actually been used for side health checks, stuff like that, are really often vulnerable to this. When you upload images, sometimes there might be URL which you could pass, and you instead of that URL you can try to abuse this. Of course, PDF generators, as I mentioned with invoices. There might be some imports via providing URLs, some preview pages, for example, email preview pages, website preview pages, and stuff like that, just to name a few. By its own, if you just detect that request being made from server to server by its own, until you exploit it, it's not really a big issue. Sometimes it's even intentional, and it could be seen as informational. Your end goal is to reach some internal servers or even reach cloud metadata endpoints, which is really impactful. Other things that you can actually do is do internal port scans for internal servers. You can store XSS payloads. So XSS, of course, could be used to steal the data of other users. You can fully compromise servers, but as I said, your end goal is to reach cloud metadata endpoints. Before we proceed to the exploitation part, let's remember our previous vulnerability, cross-site request forgery, and let's compare with server-side request forgery, because I know for beginners those two vulnerabilities sound really similar, request forgery, but actually by the exploitation and by meaning it's really different spectrum vulnerabilities. Although on the cross-site request forgery and on server-side request forgery, requests are being made from the server to server for both of those issues, but the key difference is on the cross-site request forgery, there is requirement for interaction. So it has to be a victim user which will interact with your malicious page, and that malicious page will send the request apart from that user. So this is the main requirement for cross-site request forgery. While on server-side request forgery, you don't need user interaction. It's only you interacting with a vulnerable system. So this is really big difference between those two issues. And finally, the exploitation part. This is really important to have some listener server. So if you use Burp Suite Pro, there is Collaborator. If you don't have Pro version, you can try implementing your own listener, or you can use services like Canary tokens, Ngrok, just to name a few. There might be endless options where what you can actually do to set up your listener server. And to detect SSRF, it's really straightforward and simple. The hardest part is actually exploitation part, but just to detect it, just to find parameter like URL equals, and there is HTTP blah blah blah, just replace it with your listener server IP or URL, and just to see if you receive request. It could be on the get request, it could be in the post data, put data, on the many areas, but you have to actually expect some requests going on into your server. So this is the easiest part, and the hardest part is actually exploiting. So sometimes you cannot even receive that request. You only see the parameter that maybe could indicate that there are some requests being made in the backend. Sometimes you can only reach the same server or the internal IPs of your target website. So in that case, I recommend starting out using these resources. For example, Hacktricks or Payload All the Things. Those will have different payloads and explained how you can try to use those payloads. Sometimes there might be some parameter what was exploited before, and developers might have implemented some safeguards. You have to actually try to read different payloads. Sometimes one payload might not work, but while others might do. So keep that in mind. So manipulate URL, try different things like internal IPs, and then check the response. So we briefly covered server-side request forgery. I was really happy to share this knowledge with you guys. If you really like this type of content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave some comments for what content you want to see more of. And as always, really appreciate all the feedback you are giving me, and I wish you happy hunting.